My name is Leo Maxwell. I'm 35, and my world smells like sawdust and varnish. I'm a woodworker out here in Portland, Oregon, where the misty rain and tall pines feel like they're a part of my soul. My life isn't flashy, but it's real. It's my wife Clara's warm smile in the morning, our 7-year-old daughter Maya's laughter echoing in our small home, and the satisfaction of turning a rough piece of timber into something beautiful and lasting. To anyone looking in, we have a simple, happy life. But just last week, as I stood by my grandfather's bed, the sterile, quiet air of that hospital room felt charged with a poison I had ignored for far too long. I just didn't realize that in a matter of days, that poison would erupt and try to burn my entire world to the ground. My grandfather, Arthur Maxwell, was a giant, not just in stature, but in spirit. He was a self-made man who built Maxwell Construction from a single pickup truck and a set of tools into an empire known for its integrity. He used to bring me into his workshop when I was a kid. While my father, Richard, was busy with get-rich-quick schemes and my older sister, Brenda, was calculating social ladders, Grandpa Arthur was teaching me the language of the wood. "Leo," he'd say, his voice raspy like sandpaper, "a man's character is like a piece of oak. It's about the grain, the strength that runs all the way through. Don't ever let anyone mistake a cheap veneer for solid wood." That lesson was the foundation of my life, but for the rest of my family, it was a language they never bothered to learn. That final visit to the hospital was a perfect storm of everything I'd grown to dread. The room was opulent, a private suite my mother, Evelyn, had insisted on because appearances matter, even now. She was fussing with the flowers, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. My father was pacing by the window, his phone buzzing incessantly. He wasn't taking calls from concerned friends, he was checking stock tickers. My sister Brenda, a real estate agent with teeth as sharp as her designer heels, was scrolling through her tablet, probably looking at property listings for the commercial lots my grandfather owned. They were vultures, circling, waiting. I walked over to the bed. Grandpa Arthur looked so small against the white sheets, the powerful hands that had taught me how to hold a chisel now frail and still. His eyes fluttered open and found mine. A flicker of the old strength returned. "Leo," he whispered, the word barely a breath. I squeezed his hand, trying to pour all my love and gratitude into that one touch. "I'm here, Grandpa," I said softly. Brenda chose that exact moment to walk over, her perfume suffocating the sterile air. "Dad was just saying," she began, her voice dripping with fake concern, "that we need to get a handle on the company's Q4 projections, to honor Arthur's legacy, of course." My grandfather's eyes closed, and his grip on my hand tightened for a second, a silent signal of his own exhaustion with them. My father didn't even look up from his phone. "The market is volatile, Brenda. We need to be prepared to make some decisive moves," he muttered. A cold, heavy unease settled in my stomach. They weren't just grieving in their own way, they weren't grieving at all. This was a business meeting, and my grandfather's deathbed was the conference table. I looked from their hungry, calculating faces to the dying man who had taught me everything about honor and integrity, and I felt a chasm open up between us. I was a Maxwell by name, but in that room, surrounded by my own blood, I had never felt more like an orphan. I was standing on one side of a moral universe, and they were on the other, just waiting for him to let go so they could pick the bones. Grandpa Arthur passed away less than an hour after that. It wasn't dramatic. There was no final speech or dramatic gasp for air. It was just a quiet fading. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor on the screen simply flattened. A long, unbroken tone filled the silence, a sound so final it felt like it was carving a hole in the universe. I was still holding his hand, and I felt the last bit of warmth leave him. In that moment, the only thing that felt real was the profound, crushing weight of his absence. The nurse came in, her expression professionally somber, and confirmed what the machine was already screaming. She offered her condolences with a gentle pat on my shoulder. I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The silence that followed lasted for maybe 5 seconds before my mother shattered it. Evelyn let out a loud, theatrical wail that sounded more practiced than pained. It was a performance for an invisible audience. "Oh, Arthur, gone, what will we do?" she sobbed, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. My father, Richard, simply straightened his tie. He walked over to the window, stared out at the city lights for a moment, and then turned back, his face a mask of cold pragmatism. "I'll call Henry Wallace, the lawyer, First thing in the morning, he announced to the room. Not, "I'll call my brother," or "We should let the family know." His first thought was of the will. The finality of my grandfather's death wasn't an emotional event for him. It was a starting pistol for a race I didn't even want to run. But it was my sister, Brenda, who truly turned my grief to ice. While my mother was composing herself, and my father was already mentally drafting business emails, Brenda walked over to the bedside table. She picked up Grandpa Arthur's old Rolex, the one he wore every single day of his life. It was a classic, worn but beautiful, a testament to his belief in enduring quality. "I'll take this," she said, her voice casual, as if she were claiming a trinket. "For sentimental reasons, of course, to remember him by." Something inside me snapped. I gently let go of my grandfather's hand and stood up, placing myself between her and the door. "Put it back," I said, my voice low and steady, but with an edge I didn't know I had. She scoffed, a nasty, dismissive sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. It's just a watch." "It was his watch," I replied, looking her dead in the eye. "And it stays with him until Henry Wallace tells us otherwise. It's not a party favor for you to grab on your way out." For a second, her mask of civility dropped, and I saw the raw, ugly greed in her eyes. It was a look of pure, venomous entitlement. She hesitated, probably calculating if a scene was worth it, before slamming the watch back down on the table with a loud clatter. "Fine," she hissed. "Be a saint. See where it gets you." We left the hospital and went back to my grandfather's house, a place that for me was a cathedral of happy memories, of learning and laughter. But for them, it was just the grand prize. The air was cold and stale, and as they immediately began discussing catering for the funeral and the logistics of the estate appraisal, I slipped away. I went to his study, a room that still smelled of old books and his pipe tobacco. I ran my hand over the worn leather of his armchair, and the grief I'd been holding back finally hit me in a wave, so powerful it buckled my knees. I wasn't just mourning my grandfather. I was mourning the entire idea of my family, a family that had died long before he took his last breath. All that was left were strangers who shared my last name, and I was about to be forced to sit across a table from them and watch them carve up a good man's legacy. The day of the will reading arrived under a classic Portland sky, a heavy, gray blanket of clouds that threatened a rain that never quite came. The air was cool and damp, and it felt like the weather was a perfect mirror for the cold dread that had settled deep in my bones. The funeral a few days prior had been a masterclass in hypocrisy. My father gave a eulogy about Arthur's unwavering business acumen, while my sister networked with distant, wealthy relatives, handing out her real estate business cards with a somber smile. I just stood there, clutching my wife Clara's hand, feeling like I was the only one who had actually lost a person, not a financial asset. That morning, I didn't want to go. Every part of me wanted to stay in my workshop, the one place I felt sane, and lose myself in the scent of cedar and the rhythm of my tools. Going to that lawyer's office felt like willingly walking into a cage with starving animals, but I had to. It was the last thing I could do for Grandpa Arthur, be there to witness his final wishes, to be a placeholder for the integrity he represented. I stood in front of the mirror, straightening the collar on a shirt I rarely wore. It felt like a costume. The man looking back at me, with the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his jaw, wasn't the same person he was a week ago. That man had a family. This one just had relatives. Clara came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. She rested her chin on my shoulder, her eyes meeting mine in the reflection. She didn't have to say anything. She'd been my rock through this whole thing, a silent witness to my family's monstrous behavior. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know," she said softly, her voice a warm contrast to the chill I felt inside. "Whatever happens in that room today, it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change us." "I know," I said, turning to face her. I feel like I'm walking into an ambush. They're not going there to honor him, Clara. They're going to collect. And I have this horrible feeling in my gut that it's going to be ugly." I thought about Brenda trying to take the watch, my father's immediate call to the lawyer. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. "They see me as an obstacle," I added, the thought finally taking shape in words. "Grandpa and I were close, and they've twisted that into a threat. They think he left everything to me." "Then let them think that," she said, her gaze firm. "Their greed is their problem, not yours. Just go, listen, and come home. That's all you have to do." She was right, of course. She was always the calm in my storm. Just then, our daughter Maya came running into the room, her bright pink pajamas a splash of pure joy in the otherwise gray morning. She launched herself at my legs, hugging them tightly. "Daddy, are you going to work?" she asked, her voice muffled by my pants. I knelt down, my heart aching. Her innocence was the most precious thing in the world, a world I was desperately trying to protect her from. "Not today, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "Daddy has to go to a very important meeting for Grandpa Arthur." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and serious. "Are the mean people going to be there?" she asked. My heart stopped. She had seen the way my family treated me, the way their voices sharpened and their faces hardened when I was around. A 7-year-old could see it. It was so simple to her. Good people and mean people. I didn't know how to answer, so I just hugged her. "Daddy can handle the mean people," I whispered into her hair, a promise that felt heavy and ominous. "I'll be back before you know it, okay?" I kissed her forehead, then stood up and gave Clara one last long hug. "I love you," I said. "I love you more," she replied. As I walked out the front door and toward my old pickup truck, the one Grandpa Arthur had helped me buy, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving my entire world behind. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken warnings. The simple act of driving to a lawyer's office downtown felt monumental, like I was heading off to a war I was destined to lose. The promise I made to Maya, "I'll be back soon," echoed in my head, but it felt less like a fact and more like a desperate prayer. I walked down the driveway, the keys to my old pickup feeling heavy as lead in my hand. The truck wasn't much to look at, a 20-year-old Ford with more dents than a junkyard dog has fleas, but it was honest. It was a tool, not a status symbol, which is probably why my father hated it so much. As I got closer, I saw a familiar figure sitting on the curb at the end of my street. It was Pops. He's a neighborhood fixture, an older guy, a Vietnam vet from the looks of his worn-out field jacket, who keeps to himself. My workshop is just around the corner, and most mornings I bring him a hot coffee and we exchange a few words about the weather. He's a man of few words, with eyes that have seen too much and a quiet dignity you can't help but respect. Usually he just gives me a slow, solemn nod, but not this morning. As I reached for the truck's door handle, he shot to his feet with an agility that defied his age. His eyes were wide, panicked. "Leo, wait!" he yelled, his voice a raw, urgent rasp that cut through the quiet morning air. He scrambled towards me, his movements frantic. Don't get in." I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. "Pops, what's wrong? Are you okay?" My first thought was that he was sick, maybe confused. But there was no confusion in his eyes, only pure, undiluted fear. He was pointing a trembling finger towards the undercarriage of my truck. Last night, he panted, out of breath from his short sprint. "Late. I was trying to sleep over there, behind the hedges. Saw someone, dressed in black. Hoodie up. They were under your truck, Leo, messing with it." I heard a snip. The word hung in the air between us. Snip. It was such a small sound to carry so much menace. My blood ran cold. The dread that had been a dull ache in my gut all morning sharpened into a blade of pure ice. "Are you sure, Pops?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He just nodded, his eyes darting around nervously, as if the person might still be watching. "I know what I saw," he said firmly. "I spent 2 tours in the jungle. I know the look of a man who's trying not to be seen. Something's wrong. Please, just listen to me." His certainty shook me out of my disbelief. I trusted this man's instincts more than I trusted my own family's smiles. I knelt down on the damp asphalt, my heart hammering against my ribs, and then I smelled it. The sharp, sickeningly sweet stench of gasoline, far stronger than it should be. It was pooling on the ground, a dark, iridescent puddle that seemed to be breathing, spreading like a stain of pure evil. My eyes followed the drip back to its source. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't a drip from a loose connection. The fuel line, a thick rubber hose, had been sliced clean through. It was a perfect, deliberate cut made by something sharp, like a pair of cable cutters or a knife. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The engine would have started, the fuel pump would have poured raw gasoline all over the hot engine block and the exhaust manifold. It wouldn't have just stalled, it would have become a fireball. On the road, in traffic. I would have been trapped. It wasn't just an accident waiting to happen. It was a death trap, expertly and deliberately set. I pushed myself back and sank onto the driveway, the rough surface digging into my hands. My breath came in ragged gasps. The world tilted on its axis, the quiet suburban street suddenly feeling like a war zone. This was not a random act of vandalism. No one would target my beat-up old truck. This was for me. And there was only one group of people on this planet who saw me as an obstacle to what they wanted. The mean people, as my daughter had called them. The quiet dread I'd felt, the feeling of an ambush, it wasn't paranoia. It was an instinct for survival I never knew I had. I looked up at Pops, who was watching me with a look of profound sorrow. He had just saved my life. "Thank you," I choked out, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "Pops, you..." He just shook his head, already backing away, not wanting to be involved. "You're a good man, Leo. You give an old soldier a coffee and treat him like a person. Just be careful," he said before turning and shuffling away, disappearing around the corner, leaving me alone with the gasoline fumes and the horrifying, earth-shattering certainty of what had just happened. My family, my own blood, had tried to murder me. For a long time, I just knelt there on the cold, damp asphalt, the acrid smell of gasoline burning my nostrils. The world had shrunk to that dark puddle spreading beneath my truck. My heart was a wild drum against my ribs, but my mind, strangely, was becoming unnaturally calm. The initial tidal wave of shock and terror receded, and in its wake, it left behind something hard and cold. It was the kind of clarity that comes when you're staring over the edge of a cliff. The family I knew, the one I had tried to love despite the distance between us, was a complete fiction. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. "Don't ever mistake a cheap veneer for solid wood." The veneer had just been stripped away, and underneath was nothing but rot. My first instinct was to grab my phone and dial 911, report the attempted murder, tell them everything. But then, the cold logic took over, smothering that impulse. What would I say? That my wealthy, well-respected father, my socialite mother, and my successful sister conspired to kill me? Who would be the credible witness? A homeless man named Pops who had vanished and would probably never let himself be found again? They would paint me as unhinged, greedy, the disgruntled son trying to steal the inheritance by framing his family. They had money, connections, and an army of lawyers who could turn the truth inside out until it looked like a lie. They would bury me. No, calling the cops wasn't just a bad move, it was a losing one. I couldn't fight them in their world, by their rules. I had to create a new game entirely. A reckless, insane idea began to form in the cold, quiet center of my mind. What did they want? They wanted me gone. They wanted me dead so they could get their hands on my grandfather's fortune, a fortune they mistakenly believed was mine alone. If I was dead, their guard would be down. They would get sloppy. They would celebrate. And if I was watching when they did, then I would have them. To catch a snake, you have to play dead. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I scrolled down to a name I hadn't called in a few weeks, but a name I knew I could trust with my life. Marco. We'd been best friends since we were 5, brothers in every way that mattered. While I learned to work with wood, he learned to put people back together, becoming one of the best paramedics in the city. He'd seen the worst of humanity, but he still had a core of decency that my own family lacked. He answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful. "Leo, man, I was just about to call you. You ready to lose $20 on the game this weekend?" I couldn't respond. The sheer normalcy of his words felt like they were from another lifetime. "Leo, you there?" His voice shifted, a paramedic's intuition kicking in. "What's wrong?" "Marco, I need your help," I said, my own voice sounding alien and strained. "Something's happened, something bad." I quickly, quietly, told him everything. The will reading, my family's behavior, Pops's warning, the severed fuel line. I could hear his sharp intake of breath over the phone. There was a long silence, filled with the static of my shattered world. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of all its earlier cheer. "Leo, my God, you need to go to the police, right now." "No," I said, my voice hardening with the resolve that was now cementing in my soul. "They'll crush me. I have no proof." "Marco, I'm not calling the cops. I'm calling you." "What for? What are you thinking?" he asked, a new tension in his voice. I took a deep breath, the gasoline fumes still hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. "They want me dead," I said. "So I'm going to give them what they want. I need you to help me die." Another silence, longer this time. I could picture him, probably standing by his ambulance, running a hand over his face in disbelief. "You're insane," he finally whispered. "That's, Leo, that is the craziest, most dangerous thing I have ever heard. We can't do that." "We have to," I insisted, my voice pleading. "You know what they're like. This was just the first try." "What happens next time? What if Clara and Maya are with me? They will not stop until I am gone. This is the only way I can protect my family. The only way." I let the words hang there, the mention of my wife and daughter a stark reminder of what was at stake. Marco sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. He knew my family. He'd seen their casual cruelty to me my whole life. And he, too, had revered my grandfather, who had once co-signed a loan for Marco's parents when no one else would. "Okay," he said, his voice laced with reluctance and fear. "Okay, Leo, God help us. What's the plan?" Before I answered, I looked at my phone, at the pictures of Clara and Maya, at the texts from my sister about the funeral arrangements, the whole life stored in that little black rectangle. It was a link to the man I used to be, the man who was about to die. I ended the call with Marco, walked to the curb, and smashed the phone on the pavement until it was nothing but a spiderweb of glass and plastic. The ghost protocol had begun. After smashing my phone, I felt like a ghost. I walked away from my home, from my street, from the puddle of gasoline that was the tombstone of my old life, and I didn't look back. I used the cash in my pocket to buy a burner phone from a corner store and a prepaid transit pass. Every step was deliberate, every action designed to erase the man I used to be. I sent a single, coded text to Marco. Warehouse 7, midnight. He knew the place. It was an abandoned industrial complex by the river, where we used to hang out as reckless teenagers, a place full of echoes and shadows. When I arrived, Marco was already there, parked next to a derelict loading dock. He wasn't in his ambulance. He was standing beside a rust bucket of a car I'd never seen before, a dented sedan that looked like it had already lost a dozen fights. The anxiety rolling off him was a palpable wave. His face was pale in the dim security lights, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a grim, focused tension. "You're sure about this, Leo?" he asked, his voice low. "Once we do this, there is no going back, ever." "They cut my fuel line, Marco," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "They tried to burn me alive. There's no back to go to." That seemed to settle it for him. He nodded grimly and got down to business, his paramedic training kicking in. He was all about procedure now, a way to keep the horror at bay. "Okay," he said, pointing to the junker. "Bought it for cash from a scrapyard. Untraceable. Your truck is still in your driveway. They'll find the cut fuel line, which will just convince them that the killer came back to finish the job when the first attempt failed. It makes the story stronger." He opened the trunk, and the smell that hit me was awful, a coppery, gamey scent of death. Inside was a large, heavy canvas bag. "What is that?" I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. "Weight and mass," he said, avoiding my eyes. "In a high-temperature fire, a body is mostly just carbon. The coroner won't be able to get dental records from ash, but they'll look for bone fragments, for mass. I got a deer carcass from a butcher who supplies wild game. It's the closest we can get. I'm sorry, Leo, it has to be convincing." The sheer grisly reality of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a game, this was real. The next part was the hardest. He handed me a small box. Inside was a cheap watch, a tarnished silver ring, and a wallet. My wallet. He'd picked it up from my house, telling Clara I'd left it behind, and he'd drop it off. "We need to plant your effects," he said softly. "The cops will look for non-combustible items. Keys, a watch, things that prove you were in the car." I took the wallet, my hands trembling. I flipped it open, and there it was, the little photo booth picture of Clara and Maya, their faces beaming, that I'd carried for years. I was about to plant the evidence that would convince them I was dead. The thought was a spike of pure agony in my chest. I felt a wave of nausea, the guilt so overpowering I had to lean against the car to keep from falling. "I can't do this to them, Marco," I whispered, the words cracking. "This is going to destroy them. Clara, my little girl, what am I doing?" Marco put a firm hand on my shoulder. "You're saving them," he said, his voice a fierce whisper. "You're taking the hit so they don't have to. These people, your family, they are not going to stop. This is the only way to make them stop for good. Remember that." I took a shuddering breath, his words a cold but necessary anchor. I had to become a monster to fight the monsters. I took my driver's license out of the wallet, no need to make the ID immediate, but left the credit cards. I slipped the ring on the deer's leg bone and tossed the keys on the floor of the junker. Then, I took the picture of Clara and Maya, held it for a moment, and tucked it into the pocket of an old jacket I was leaving on the passenger seat. I placed my wallet in the glove box. Each action was a betrayal. Each item a lie that would break the hearts of the only two people I had ever truly loved. We drove in silence to the spot, a treacherous, unlit curve on a rural highway about an hour outside the city. It was a place notorious for accidents. With Marco driving his own car behind me, I pulled the junker over 100 yards before the curve. Using the burner phone, I made one last call to my home number. It went to voicemail, and I heard Clara's voice, warm and loving. "Hi, you've reached the Maxwells. We can't get to the phone, so leave a message." I didn't say anything. I just listened to her voice one last time, a ghost listening to a life he could no longer have. Then I hung up and threw the phone into the woods. We put the car in neutral. Marco stood by the driver's side, ready to give it the final push. I stood back, my heart a frantic trapped bird in my chest. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. He shoved the car, and it began to roll, slow at first, then faster, a metal coffin on its way to the grave I had built for myself. It hit the big oak tree at the apex of the curve with a sickening crunch of metal and glass that echoed through the silent forest. A beat later, the gas canister we'd rigged with a simple timer went off. It wasn't an explosion, just a deep whoosh as the world ignited. Flames erupted from the car, climbing high into the night sky, turning the dark woods into a flickering, hellish landscape. I stood there, hidden in the trees, and watched my life burn. The anxiety and guilt were still there, but now they were joined by a terrifying new feeling, the cold, empty freedom of a man who had nothing left to lose. The hours after the fire were a blur of adrenaline and dread. Marco drove me to a place he'd prepared, a dingy, anonymous motel on the industrial outskirts of Portland, the kind of place where people go to disappear. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. He handed me a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, some cash, and a new encrypted laptop. "Stay off the grid, Leo. No logging into old accounts, no social media, nothing. As of right now, you don't exist," he said, his face etched with worry. "The first responders called it in. It'll be on the news by morning." He left, and the silence he left behind was deafening. I was a ghost in a purgatory of cheap wood paneling and a buzzing neon sign outside my window. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, watching the local 24-hour news channel on a flickering old television. And then, at 5:14 a.m., it happened. My face, my old smiling face from a family photo, appeared on the screen. "Tragedy on Highway 26, the chipper morning anchor announced. A local businessman, Leo Maxwell, is presumed dead after his vehicle went off the road and was consumed by fire. Presumed dead." The words felt hollow, unreal. They showed a picture of the smoldering wreckage of the car, a blackened metal skeleton against the gray morning light. I felt a horrifying wave of detachment, like I was watching a movie about someone else. The news report was 5 sentences long. That was it. My entire life, reduced to a brief, tragic news bite between a car commercial and the weather forecast. Later that morning, Marco sent me a secure link. "Hospital waiting room, camera 4. They're on their way." My heart started to pound a sick, heavy rhythm. This was it, the first test. I opened the link, and a grainy, black and white video feed filled my laptop screen. It was the generic, sterile waiting area of the city hospital's emergency wing. A few minutes later, the doors slid open, and they walked in. My family, my mother, Evelyn, was a masterpiece of performative grief, leaning so heavily on my father I thought she might collapse. Her face was buried in a handkerchief. My father, Richard, looked grim and stoic, his jaw set, playing the part of the strong, devastated patriarch. And Brenda, my sister, followed behind them, her face pale and her eyes wide with what, to any outside observer, would look like pure shock. They were perfect. They were utterly convincing. A trusted colleague of Marco's, a weary-looking doctor, came out to speak with them. I couldn't hear the audio, but I didn't need to. I saw the doctor's somber expression, the gentle hand on my father's shoulder. I saw my mother's body rack with a silent, theatrical sob. I saw Brenda cover her mouth, her shoulders shaking. The doctor gave them his condolences and walked away. For a full minute, they held the pose, three statues of grief in a temple of sorrow. And then, the mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. Evelyn, my mother, stood up straight. She put her handkerchief away, her face instantly transforming from grief-stricken to impatient. She smoothed the wrinkles on her expensive coat. My father pulled out his phone, glanced at it, and then looked at his watch. Brenda, my sister, was the first to speak. I saw her words form on the grainy feed, her expression cold and all business. "Did you call Henry Wallace yet?" My father shook his head, typing something on his phone. "He's next on the list. We need to get the death certificate issued first. It'll be faster if the body is unrecoverable." My mother nodded, scanning the waiting room as if she were inspecting it for cleanliness. "The funeral has to be tasteful," she murmured, just loud enough for me to read her lips. "The right people will be watching." I sat there, in my cheap motel room, and watched them. They weren't grieving, they were planning, they were strategizing. My death wasn't a tragedy to them, it was a business transaction, an inconvenient but necessary step on the path to getting what they wanted. The pain and guilt that had been eating me alive curdled into something else. It was a white-hot, clarifying rage. The betrayal was so absolute, so pure, it was almost stunning. My hands stopped shaking. The cold resolve I'd felt on my driveway returned, but this time it wasn't just cold, it was razor sharp. I opened a new browser on the laptop, and through a series of encrypted servers, I started searching. I wasn't looking for a therapist or a lawyer. I was looking for a weapon. I found her in less than an hour, Miss Harding, a private investigator. Her reputation was whispered on the darker corners of the internet. Ex-police, took no prisoners, and specialized in uncovering the secrets of the city's elite. She was expensive, and she was dangerous. She was perfect. I called her from a scrambled number. A woman with a voice like gravel and whiskey answered on the first ring. "Yeah? I need you to watch 3 people," I said, my voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Richard, Evelyn, and Brenda Maxwell. I want to know everything they do, everyone they talk to, every dollar they spend. I want them under a microscope." There was a pause. "This kind of surveillance is costly," she grunted, "especially for a family like the Maxwells." "The money is being wired to your account as we speak," I said. Another pause, this one shorter. I could almost hear her thinking. "A job like this, it usually comes from someone with a personal stake. Who is this?" I looked at my own face on the frozen news report on the television screen. "I'm the man they just killed," I said, and hung up. The days that followed that phone call were the longest of my life. I was a ghost haunted by the living. My world shrank to the 4 walls of that motel room. I'd watch the sun come up, staining the industrial haze outside my window a dirty orange, and I'd watch it go down again. I kept the television on, the volume low, the local news playing on a loop. Every time my face flickered across the screen, it was a fresh stab of surreal horror. They were reporting on my memorial service, showing file footage of my father looking stoic and Brenda dabbing her eyes. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years were quoted, saying what a good, quiet man I was. It was my own funeral, and I was watching it from a front row seat in hell. The isolation was a physical weight. Every instinct screamed at me to call Clara, to let her know I was alive, to end the monstrous pain I was putting her and Maya through. The thought of their grief was a constant, grinding agony. But I couldn't. I had to see this through. I would scroll through encrypted news articles about my own death, searching for any mention of my wife and daughter, desperate for any sign that they were okay. My rage was the only thing that kept the guilt from swallowing me whole. It was the fuel, the fire that kept me going in the dark. Then, 4 days after I hired her, I got the first message from Miss Harding. It appeared in a secure, anonymous chat window on my laptop. There was no greeting, just a single audio file and a line of text beneath it. "Is greater than, you were right, they're not grieving, they're celebrating. Is greater than location, Vantage, private dining room, last night. Vantage, the most obscenely expensive restaurant in Portland, perched on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper with panoramic views of the city they now believed they owned. It was a place my grandfather had despised, calling it a glass box for peacocks. It was the perfect setting for their victory dinner. My hand was trembling as I clicked on the file and put on a pair of cheap headphones. The audio was crystal clear. Harding must have planted a bug in the room. The first thing I heard was the festive clinking of wine glasses. Begin audio recording. Evelyn, a light, airy laugh. I have to say, the outpouring of sympathy has been simply overwhelming. Carol Henderson from the gallery said, "We've handled this tragedy with such dignity." Richard, "Dignity is good for appearances, Evelyn. Profit is better. The preliminary numbers from the auditors are excellent. With Leo out of the picture, we can finally liquidate those sentimental assets Arthur was so attached to. That timberland parcel upstate, the one he refused to sell because it would mean firing a few old-timers, it's worth a fortune to developers. Brenda, please, Dad, let's not call them assets. Let's call them what they are, ours. Finally, to us, to new beginnings." Sound of more clinking glasses. Evelyn, "Oh, Brenda, that's a bit morbid, don't you think?" Brenda scoffs. "What's morbid is that he spent his whole life playing with blocks of wood in that dusty workshop instead of learning the family business. Honestly, this whole situation is for the best. He finally did something decisive for once, even if it was just driving off a road. He was always a loose end. Now, the inheritance is clean. The reading with Henry Wallace will be a simple formality." Richard, "She's right, Evelyn. This simplifies everything. No more pandering to Arthur's bleeding heart ideals. We can run Maxwell Construction the way it should have been run for the last 20 years. Like a business, not a charity." I ripped the headphones from my ears, my breath catching in my throat. I felt a wave of profound, bottomless disgust that was so intense it made me physically sick. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the casual, cheerful cruelty, the laughter. They were toasting. They were toasting my death. Brenda's joke, "He finally did something decisive," bounced around in my skull, each echo a fresh wound, a loose end. That's all I had ever been to them. An inconvenient variable in their financial equation. All the pain, all the guilt I felt over what I was doing to Clara and Maya vanished in that moment, burned away by the pure, unadulterated poison of their voices. These people weren't my family. They were monsters wearing the faces of my parents and my sister. They had stripped my grandfather's legacy of all its meaning and were dancing on my grave before the dirt had even settled. I sat back, the cheap motel chair groaning under my weight, and a new, terrifying calm washed over me. This was no longer just about justice. This was about eradication. I would pull their whole rotten world down around them, stone by stone, until nothing was left but the truth. The audio recording from Vantage changed the mission. My grief had been a fog, my guilt a cage, but the sound of my family's laughter over my supposed grave was a cleansing fire. It burned everything away, leaving only a core of cold, hard purpose. I was no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows. I was a hunter, and I was learning to think like my prey. I listened to the recording a dozen times, not for the pain, but for the details. My father was the strategist, my mother the publicist, but it was Brenda's words that held the key. He was always a loose end. It was personal for her. She was the one who saw me not just as a financial obstacle, but as an infuriating, sentimental flaw in her perfect, ruthless world. She was the impatient one, the one who would have wanted the mess cleaned up quickly and personally. I sent a new message to Miss Harding. It was no longer a request, it was an order. Is greater than, forget the parents for now, focus on the sister. Every second of every day, I want to know when she breathes. Harding's reply was instantaneous. Ist größer als understood. For the next 2 days, my laptop became my only window to the outside world, a constant stream of sterile, factual updates from Harding. Brenda's life was a curated feed of success and privilege. Is greater than 9:15 a.m. Hot yoga, Pearl District, is greater than 11 a.m. Meeting with developers, downtown, is greater than 1:30 p.m. Lunch, 2 Michelin stars. I watched her move through my city, a queen in her kingdom, completely oblivious to the ghost watching her every move. It was maddening, but I forced myself to be patient. My grandfather taught me that the finest work requires a steady hand. Brenda, for all her ambition, was impatient. I knew she would eventually make a mistake. The break came on a Thursday afternoon. The message from Harding was different. It had a charge of adrenaline I could feel even through the screen. Is greater than subject is deviating from routine. Cancelled a 3 p.m. showing. She's on the move, heading east, across the bridge. This was it. There was nothing for Brenda in the industrial zones across the river. No high-end clients, no boutique coffee shops. Only rust, warehouses, and the parts of the city that people like her pretended didn't exist. I sat hunched over my laptop, my knuckles white, as Harding's updates came in short, clipped bursts. Is greater than, she's in the Gresham Industrial Park. Parking by the abandoned cannery is greater than waiting, is greater than photos incoming. My screen refreshed, and the first image appeared. It was a long lens shot, slightly grainy but perfectly clear. There was Brenda, standing beside her immaculate luxury SUV, looking completely out of place against a backdrop of graffiti-covered brick and broken windows. She was tapping her expensive shoe on the cracked pavement, checking her phone, her impatience radiating even in a still photo. The next photo made my breath catch. A man was walking towards her, out of the shadows of a loading dock. He was big, with a shaved head and tattoos covering his arms like a sleeve of snakes. He was the polar opposite of her polished world. And then, the money shot, the photo that sealed her fate. Harding had captured the exact moment of the exchange. Brenda, her face tight with disdain, furtively passing a thick, bulging manila envelope to the thug. He was taking it from her with a greasy smirk on his face. There was no mistaking it. It was a payoff. The final payment for a job she believed was successfully completed. I stared at the image, the disgusting, perfect proof of her crime. This was the man. This was the person who had crawled under my truck in the dead of night, who had held the tool that was meant to end my life. Miss Harding was already a step ahead. A few minutes later, another file appeared. Is greater than, got his license plate when he left. Ran it through an old contact at the precinct. Is greater than, name, Vinny Gallo. Is greater than attached file is his record. I clicked it open. A mugshot filled my screen, the same sneering, greasy face from the photograph. And below it, a long list of prior convictions. Assault, grand theft auto, possession with intent to distribute. He was a low-life career criminal, a tool. And Brenda had been stupid enough, arrogant enough, to meet him in person. I looked from the photo of Brenda's clean, manicured hand passing the envelope to the soulless, dead eyes of Vinny Gallo in his mugshot. The chain of evidence was forming, link by damning link. I finally had a face to go with the hand that held the knife, and I knew with absolute certainty what I had to do next. Staring at Vinny Gallo's mugshot was like looking at the physical embodiment of my family's evil. He was the tool they had used, the blunt instrument they had hired to erase me. The photos Harding took were damning, but a skilled lawyer could muddy the waters, claim it was blackmail, anything. I needed more. I needed his voice. I needed a confession, raw and undeniable, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I had to get it myself. This was a step into a new, darker world, a place from which I might not come back, but it was a step I had to take. My first move was to erase Leo Maxwell completely. I used the cash Marco had given me to buy a new identity from a rack at a thrift store. Worn work boots, a faded flannel shirt, and a grimy baseball cap I could pull down low. I let my stubble grow into a rough, unkempt beard and spent an afternoon in my motel bathroom with a box of cheap black hair dye. The man who stared back at me from the mirror was a stranger, haggard, haunted, and with a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. He was ready. I sent Harding a message. Is greater than find out where Gallo drinks. The reply came 2 hours later. As brutally efficient as always, is greater than the Rusty Anchor. It's a dive bar off the industrial strip. He's a regular. Goes there most nights after 9 p.m. That night, I walked into the Rusty Anchor, and the wave of noise and stench that hit me was a physical force. It smelled of stale beer, regret, and desperation. Dim, yellow light filtered through a haze of smoke, illuminating the faces of men who looked like they'd been beaten down by life and were now drinking to forget it. And there he was, sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey, exactly like Harding said. Vinny Gallo in the flesh. For a moment, every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. I was face to face with the man who had left me for dead, but I pushed the fear down, letting the cold, hard rage take its place. I walked up and sat on the stool next to him. I ordered a beer I had no intention of drinking. He glanced at me, his eyes dismissive, and then looked away. I let the silence hang for a minute before I spoke, pitching my voice lower, rougher. Vinny Gallo? He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Who's askin'? He grunted. A businessman, I said, my voice calm and steady. A a performance of a lifetime, one who appreciates quality work. I heard you recently did a job for the Maxwell family, an automotive issue. Very permanent. His whole body tensed. He started to slide off his stool, his hand instinctively going to his side. I don't know what you're talking about, he snarled. Relax, I said, not moving a muscle. I slowly reached into my jacket, and he flinched, but I just pulled out a thick envelope and slid it across the sticky bar top. That's $5,000, I said quietly. It's a down payment. I have a similar loose end that needs tying up, and I want the best. I want the man who was skilled enough to handle a job for a family like the Maxwells and get away clean. Greed warred with suspicion in his eyes, and greed won. He cautiously picked up the envelope, felt its thickness, and a slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He sat back down. All right, he said, his tone shifting from hostile to conspiratorial. You got my attention. What do you need to know? This was it. I leaned in, my heart hammering, and hit the record button on the small digital device in my pocket. I just need to know you're the real deal, I said, my voice a low murmur. The Maxwell job, that was slick. No witnesses, no evidence. How'd you do it? Tell me about it. His ego, puffed up by the cash and the flattery, took over. He leaned in, his breath sour with whiskey. The sister, Brenda, she's a piece of work, he chuckled. Paid half up front. Wanted her brother gone before some big will reading. Said he was a problem. Easy job. The guy lived in a quiet neighborhood, drove an old piece of junk. I went in late, after midnight. Crawled right under it. My blood ran cold, but I kept my face a mask of professional interest. Just a quick cut and go, I prompted. Yeah, that's the beauty of it, he boasted, taking a swig of his whiskey. You don't gotta be a genius. Just gotta have the nerve. I took a pair of cable cutters to the fuel line. A clean snip. He starts the car, drives a few blocks, the engine gets hot, the gas leaks all over the manifold. Boom. He grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. A tragic accident. Nobody asks any questions. She paid me the other half yesterday, said it worked like a charm. I had it, a full confession, complete with motive and method. I felt a dizzying mix of triumph and revulsion. I stood up, leaving my full beer on the bar. Good work, I said, my voice like ice. I'll be in touch with the details for the new job. I turned and walked towards the door, every muscle in my back screaming, expecting a hand to grab my shoulder or the crack of a bottle. I didn't dare look back. I pushed the door open, stepped out into the cold, damp night air, and didn't stop walking until the sounds and smells of the rusty anchor were a distant memory. I leaned against a cold brick wall in a dark alley a few blocks away, my body trembling, and clutched the recorder in my pocket. It felt like the heaviest, most valuable thing in the entire world. I had faced the devil, and I had walked out of hell with his soul on a wire. I walked out of that alley holding the digital recorder like it was a sacred relic. Vinnie Gallo's confession was the final piece of the puzzle, the key that would unlock my family's prison doors. But evidence that powerful was also a liability. I couldn't keep it on me. I went to a 24-hour diner, ordered a coffee I didn't drink, and used their public Wi-Fi to send a message to Miss Harding. My instructions were precise, a dead drop. I would leave the recorder, along with a full, typed narrative of everything that had happened, taped to the underside of a specific toilet tank in a specific stall at the downtown public library. My instructions for her were just as precise. Is greater than, take this directly to Detective Miller at the Central Precinct. He's an old-timer, knew my grandfather. He's one of the few who can't be bought. Tell him the evidence is ironclad, but he is not to act on it. Not yet. Tell him to get the warrants ready and wait for my signal. Harding confirmed the drop was made and the package was delivered. After that, all I could do was wait for my family to make the next move. I knew they wouldn't wait long. Their greed was a frantic, hungry thing. Sure enough, Harding's reports started coming in. My father and Brenda were putting immense pressure on Henry Wallace, my grandfather's lawyer. They were at his office almost daily, citing shareholder anxiety and the need for continuity of leadership at the company. It was a thinly veiled threat, a power play to force his hand. Henry, to his credit, held them off for as long as he could. Harding noted that he seemed wary of their haste, burying them in procedural paperwork. He had been my grandfather's friend for 40 years. He knew Arthur, and he knew my family. He must have sensed that something was deeply wrong. But eventually, under the threat of legal action, he had to relent. A week later, Harding forwarded me an official email. It was a notice from the law offices of Wallace and Associates, scheduling the final, official reading of Arthur Maxwell's last will and testament. It was addressed to all beneficiaries, a short, formal list. And seeing my own name there, Leo Maxwell, felt like reading my own obituary. The date was set. The day of reckoning was here. On the morning of the reading, I woke up before the Sunday. The rage and anxiety that had been my constant companions had settled into a profound, unnerving calm. Today, the ghost was coming home. I looked at the stranger in the motel mirror. The cheap black dye was starting to fade, and the beard was rough, but the eyes were what had changed the most. They were the eyes of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side made of something harder than steel. I took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away the grime of my exile. I shaved off the beard, feeling the familiar shape of my own face emerge from beneath the disguise. I put on the one good suit I owned, the one Marco had retrieved from my house. It felt strange and familiar all at once, a costume for a man I was about to become again. As I tied my tie, a final report came in from Harding, who was staked out across from Henry Wallace's downtown office. Is greater than... They're here. Black Mercedes. They're making a show of it. Attached was a photo. There they were. My father, Richard, in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than my truck, looking stern and powerful. My mother, Evelyn, beside him, in a ridiculously dramatic black dress and a veiled hat, playing the part of the grieving widow to perfection. And my sister Brenda, stepping out of the car in a sharp, dark pantsuit, a predatory smirk just barely hidden on her lips. They didn't look like a family in mourning. They looked like royalty arriving for their coronation. They were confident, triumphant, and utterly oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their heads. They thought they were walking in to claim their prize. They had no idea they were walking into their own execution. I looked at the picture one last time, then put my phone away. I straightened my tie, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. The trap was set. The players were in position. All that was left was for the ghost to make his entrance. I walked through the hallowed, hushed halls of the law firm, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and money. I could feel the receptionist's eyes on my back, a confused stare for the man who was supposed to be dead. I didn't care. I stopped outside the heavy oak doors of the main conference room. From inside, I could hear the low, somber tones of Henry Wallace beginning the proceedings. My heart was a steady, heavy drum. This wasn't fear, it was purpose. I put my hand on the cold brass handle, took one final deep breath, and opened the door. The room was exactly as I'd pictured it, a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. At the far end of the table sat Henry Wallace, a stack of legal documents before him, and seated along the sides were my family, my executioners. They were all looking at Henry, their faces a carefully composed blend of solemnity and greedy anticipation. They didn't see me at first. Henry paused, his eyes widening in stunned, absolute disbelief. "My God," he whispered. My father, annoyed by the interruption, turned his head, his brow furrowed with irritation. His eyes met mine. The illusion of the powerful, composed patriarch shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. His jaw dropped, a comical, grotesque expression of shock. Beside him, my mother looked up, and a strangled, horrified gasp escaped her lips. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes impossibly wide. But Brenda's reaction was the one I will never forget. It wasn't just shock. It was the raw, primal terror of a predator who has just realized it stepped into a trap. "No," she stammered, the word a choked, broken thing. You can't be. You're dead." "Not yet," I said, my voice calm and clear in the suddenly silent room. It was the first time they had heard my voice since I'd stood by my grandfather's bed, and it hit them like a physical blow. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the length of the table, my eyes never leaving theirs. I watched the terror bloom on their faces, the dawning, horrific understanding of what was happening. I didn't shout, I didn't rage. I let the silence and the sheer impossibility of my presence do the work. I reached the head of the table, and from my jacket pocket, I pulled out a small, simple USB drive. I placed it on the polished table with a soft click. Henry Wallace, shaking off his own shock, looked from my face to the drive, and a lifetime of legal instinct and friendship with my grandfather connected the dots. A grim, hard light entered his eyes. He understood. Without a word, he took the drive, plugged it into the laptop connected to the large screen at the end of the room, and hit play. The first thing that filled the silent, cavernous room was the festive, cheerful clinking of wine glasses. My family flinched as if they'd been shot. Then came their own voices, amplified and crystal clear, celebrating my death at Vantage. I watched my mother's face crumble as she heard herself talking about the dignity of the tragedy. I watched my father's face turn a blotchy, furious red as his own words about sentimental assets and liquidating my grandfather's legacy echoed around him. And I locked eyes with Brenda as she was forced to listen to herself call me a loose end and joke about my death. She couldn't look away. I wouldn't let her. Before they could even process the horror of what they were hearing, Henry clicked the next file. The screen lit up, and the greasy, sneering face of Vinnie Gallo filled the room. His recorded voice, boastful and slurring from whiskey, was even more damning. The sister, Brenda, she's a piece of work. Paid half up front. Wanted her brother gone. I took a pair of cable cutters to the fuel line. A clean snip. He starts the car. Boom. A tragic accident. That's when the chaos erupted. "This is a lie, a trick," my father roared, scrambling to his feet, his chair screeching back on the hardwood floor. "The tapes are fake. He's trying to frame us." My mother dissolved into hysterical, genuine sobs not of grief, but of pure, panicked fear. Brenda was silent, frozen in her chair, her face a mask of waxy, corpse-like terror. She knew. She knew it was all over. "It's not a trick, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his panicked shouts like a surgeon's scalpel. "It's the truth. The truth you tried to burn and bury on the side of a highway." As if on cue, the heavy oak doors to the conference room swung open again. But it wasn't a ghost this time. It was Detective Miller, a man with a face like a bulldog and eyes that had seen it all, flanked by two uniformed officers. Their presence sucked all the air out of the room. The shouting stopped. My mother's sobs hitched into terrified silence. "Richard, Evelyn, and Brenda Maxwell," Detective Miller said, his voice a low, unimpressed rumble that carried the weight of the law. "You are all under arrest for the conspiracy to commit murder of Leo Maxwell." The officers moved with quiet efficiency. One went to my father, who stood there, sputtering, his power and influence vanishing into thin air. The other went to Brenda, who didn't even resist, her body limp as she was pulled to her feet. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. As they led my sister past me, her eyes, filled with a venomous, bottomless hatred, met mine. "You were always a mistake," she hissed, her voice a snake's whisper. I looked at the woman who had shared my childhood, the woman who had tried to have me burned alive, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. "No, Brenda," I said softly. "You were." They were led out of the room, my mother weeping, my father shouting about his lawyers, my sister silent and broken. They were stripped of their dignity, their power, and their freedom, all in the space of 10 minutes. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in the silent conference room with Henry Wallace, the damning evidence still glowing on the screen. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered. The silence that descended upon the conference room after they were gone was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, filled with the ghosts of the lives that had just been shattered. I stood there, staring at the empty chairs, feeling nothing like a victor. I just felt empty. The adrenaline was gone, and in its place was a bone-deep weariness. Henry Wallace walked over to a small, handsome cabinet in the corner and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He handed one to me. His hand was steady, but his eyes were filled with a profound sadness. "Your grandfather was my oldest friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was worried about this. Not murder, my God, but he was worried about their characters. He saw the rot starting to set in. He sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He would be so damn proud of you, Leo. You have his strength. You have that solid oak core he was always talking about." I didn't feel strong. I felt hollowed out. "What happens now, Henry?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Now," he said, walking back to the table, "we do the one thing we were all here to do in the first place." He picked up the thick vellum document that was my grandfather's will. "Your family is gone, the police have what they need. There's no one left to hear this but you. and I think Arthur would want you to hear it." He cleared his throat and began to read. He skipped past the legal jargon, the formal declarations, and went straight to the distribution of the estate. My body was tensed, braced for the revelation that had caused all this destruction. And when the words came, they were the cruelest, most tragic punchline I could have ever imagined. My grandfather's estate was to be divided into 4 almost equal parts. 1 part for his son, my father Richard, 1 part for my sister Brenda, 1 part to be held in trust for my mother, Evelyn, and 1 part for me. I just stared at him, my mind unable to process it. They were going to get it all anyway? I asked, my voice cracking. They were going to be rich beyond their wildest dreams? Yes, Henry said softly. Arthur loved his children, even when he was disappointed in them. He wanted to provide for them. Their share would have been in the tens of millions, each. The sheer pointless absurdity of it all hit me like a physical blow. I sank into a chair, the whiskey glass trembling in my hand. They had torn the world apart, tried to murder their own blood, and destroyed their lives for nothing. For a paranoid fantasy born of a greed so deep and so rotten, it had made them blind. They had everything, and they threw it all away because they couldn't stand the thought of me having my share. The victory I thought I'd achieved felt like ashes in my mouth. It wasn't a victory, it was just the end of a tragedy. Legally, Henry continued, his voice gentle, it's all moot now. Under state law, the Slayer rule is very clear. A person who feloniously and intentionally kills or participates in the killing of another cannot inherit from that person's estate. Their charges will ensure a conviction. By law, their shares are forfeited. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and awe. It all defaults to you, Leo. The company, the properties, the entire fortune. It's all yours. The story jumped forward 6 months. The headlines had faded. The trial was a formality. With Gallo's confession and their own words on tape, my family was convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. The great Maxwell name was now synonymous with scandal, and I was, on paper, one of the wealthiest men in the state. But I didn't move into a mansion. I didn't buy a fleet of expensive cars. I stayed in my small house with Clara and Maya. The first time I saw them after it was all over, after I had told them the whole ugly truth, we just held each other for hours, healing the wounds of the lies I'd been forced to tell. Their love was the only inheritance I had ever truly wanted. About a month ago, I made a decision. I sold off the majority of the corporate assets, the commercial holdings, and the stock portfolio my father had coveted. I kept the core of Maxwell Construction, rehiring the old-timers my father had planned to fire and restructuring it to reflect my grandfather's values. And with the rest of the vast, unwanted fortune, I created the Arthur Maxwell Foundation. Its sole purpose is to give scholarships to young people who want to enter the skilled trades, the carpenters, masons, welders, and electricians. The people who, like my grandfather, build the world with their own 2 hands. My life is quiet now. The nightmares are starting to fade. This morning I was out in my workshop, the sun streaming through the windows, the familiar smell of cedarwood in the air. Maya, now a little older, was standing on a stool beside me, her small hands carefully sanding a little wooden bird we were carving. She was focused, her tongue sticking out the corner of her mouth, just like I do when I'm working. I looked up and saw Clara leaning in the doorway, watching us, a soft, peaceful smile on her face. In that moment, surrounded by the love of my real family and the craft that my grandfather had given me, I finally understood. He hadn't left me a fortune, he had left me a foundation, and it was my turn to build on it.